On my cue, you'll have a second and a half. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Winningham, House of Fern, and it is Do You Know Who You Are hour. Normally it'd be Do You Know Who You Are 2 hours, but what's happened, I guess we've been having some problems with Skype and things, and so we're a little bit late getting on, and but we're going to have to end at the normal time because I got to get up tomorrow morning. So anyways, I have a website. It's www.sovereigntyinternational.info. I've also got, if for anybody that's interested in learning more about this, a couple groups. I got one at Yahoo and one at Google. They're both called Administrating Your Public Servants. And what we're going to do is we're going to start at the beginning of my PowerPoint presentations. So we'll just do the summary today. That's about all we'll have time for, and maybe we'll start into citizenship a little bit. But we'll be talking about the what I do with when I come and do a private information share, and we'll be talking about all the material that I cover. When I do a private information share, usually it lasts a long day, but I have to say I've added a lot of material to it, and so I'm thinking it might be more like a day and a half now. But anyway, so we'll start off. When we do the private information share, I ask two things, or even now. Okay, for those of you who are learning about this stuff, there's two things I ask. First of all, if you do not get a concept, put it in the back of your mind and think about it. These concepts are very abstract. The law is very abstract. It's not something you can touch or feel, but it affects you everywhere. And it comes to you over time. When this was first brought to me, I told the guy he was nuts. So I understand that sometimes some concepts are difficult to grasp. And so just give you some time to think about it and start looking into it, and it will come to you. And secondly, I've spent literally tens of thousands of dollars doing this stuff. And so you're getting it for free today, and if you come to one of my private information shares, it's certainly it's not for free, but it's certainly not as expensive as what I paid. And so the requirement is that you pay it forward. And if you don't know what it means when I say pay it forward, there's a movie, rent the movie, and you'll know what it means. So what we're going to talk about is some basic principles of law today that apply in all countries everywhere. And in many countries, evidence of these principles are more well hidden than in other countries. America, there's a lot of court cases that talk about it, but you'll find that I've got court cases from Australia, I've got court cases from England, I've got court cases from Canada, New Zealand, and I am. There's just loads of evidence that it's everywhere, and but it gets in some countries they've hidden it more well than others. So does anybody know what the word occult means? And think about that. The information we cover is considered occult material by many. And if you look up occult in Wikipedia, it means that it's hidden knowledge. And, quote, the word occult comes from the Latin word occultus, which means clandestine, hidden, secret, referring to knowledge of the hidden. And that's taken directly from Wikipedia. So, I was always taught that occult was something that was real bad and evil and all that. Well, I suppose if you're the powers that be, it's evil, because they don't want anybody knowing this stuff. And but all it is hidden knowledge. It's knowledge that is, think about it. We're all products of the government's educational system. And the government has taught us what we need to know to operate in their system, but they haven't taught us everything. And so the burden's on us to go out and learn this other stuff. So anyways, to move on, In the citizenship presentation, we will learn how we're all literally kings and queens, and the only power held by government is power that we delegated. Now, if you think about that, do you have the power, or do I have the power to take your property and give it to some guy down the street because he doesn't have any money? Well, the answer to that is no. And so therefore, if the only power held by the government is delegated, then neither does the government have that. And if the government is doing that, it's because you've agreed to it somehow. And that's what we have to learn, is that all of this stuff is by consent, and we have to quit consenting. Now, another principle here is the current government is de facto. And de facto means, this is taken from Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1856 edition, says actual, existing in fact, having effect, even though not formally or legally recognized. And then definition 2 says illegitimate, but in effect. And then it says a de facto government. Okay, well, I got to tell you that almost all governments are de facto. And there are some de jure governments. The Republic of Texas is a de jure government. I believe that Ukraine is probably a de jure government. But there's not too many de jure governments on the planet, and most of them are de facto. And the burden's on us to know about that stuff. And when we start telling our public servants that they're de facto, that they don't have any authority, everything changes. And we'll go through and see how all of that stuff applies, how they're de facto, how they have no authority. We'll talk about that in the presentation called Color of Law. And everything they do is under the color of law. And there's no real justice in their courts. And this is what we have to understand, is that if we want some real justice, then we, the people, need to bring our de jure government out of abeyance. And that means it's going to take some work. And our de jure government is there. It's waiting for us to bring it out. So here's a court citation from Atkins versus Lanning, and that's from the D.C. District Circuit, U.S. District Court for Oklahoma. And that's at 415 Federal Supplements, 186. Color of law means the appearance or substance without the substance of legal rights. Misuse of power possessed by virtue of state law and made possible only because wrongdoers clothed with authority of state is action taken under color of law. So that's what they do, and that's what we're going to learn about in the color of law presentation. In the martial law presentation, we learn about how they're under martial law and have been for decades, and how they're using municipal corporate law to enforce it. And in the commerce presentation, we learned that it is all Roman law and how it comes from the Vatican. And this has been going on from the beginning of time. In multiple presentations, we talk about how it's all voluntary. You have to agree to it. They are getting you to agree, and you've got to learn what's happening and how it works and quit agreeing. In the presentation on the ultimate solution to jure government, we learned how the government is bankrupt. And it is now owned and operated by international bankster thieves who operate exclusively under Roman law. And you know, these wars that are going on, these wars are nothing more than giant commercial transactions so that the bankster thieves can make all sorts of money. And ultimately, the money goes to the Vatican. Quote, "It is an established fact that the United States federal government has been dissolved by the Emergency Banking Act, March 9, 1933, 48 Pat 1, Public Law 89-719, declared by President Roosevelt being bankrupt and insolvent. H.J.R. 192, 73rd Congress, in session, June 5, 1933, joint resolution to suspend the gold standard and abrogate the gold clause, dissolve the sovereign authority of the United States in the official capacities of all United States governmental officers and departments, and is further evidence that the United States federal government exists today in name only." Unquote. That is taken from the United States Congressional Record, March 17, 1933, Volume 33. I'm sorry. That's the United States Congressional Record, March 17, 1993. And that's volume 33. So the United States government is de facto. It's not our de jure government anymore. It's owned by international bankster thieves. And they're operating it for their profit. In the presentations on attorneys, we learn how foreign agents of the Vatican have seized control of our government and are operating it as an international criminal racketeering enterprise. In the presentation on money and in the presentation on land, we learned how the bankster thieves are compelling us to use their so-called money to facilitate the theft of everything possible. And we're not the ones that are stealing it. They're the ones that are stealing it from us. Essentially, we have a gang of pirates that have seized control of the government on the high seas of commerce, and the gang of pirates is looking for a surprise. And we, the people, have abdicated our responsibilities. You know, I don't know how many people know this. I don't know how many people remember this. It was back a couple of years ago, there was these pirates off the coast of Somalia that were capturing ships and kidnapping the captains and people off the ships and wanting ransom to release them. And the U.S. Navy went over and captured some of those pirates, and they brought them into New York, and they put them on trial. And you know what came out in that trial? They said that they were owned and operated by Goldman Sachs in New York City. So the point is that piracy is a perfectly legitimate enterprise. And we, the people, have to learn what's going on and quit participating. This is literally the war of good versus evil that was talked about in the book of Revelations. In the presentation on the ultimate solution to de jure government, we learned how our de jure government is in abeyance, which means dormancy, and all we have to do is start to operate it. In the assertive sovereignty presentation, we learn how we can assert our own sovereignty and how we learn how to use officers of the court as third-party witnesses for our notices and why. That is one of the most powerful things you can do because it's very difficult to call a judge a liar. And some of these judges are honest and some of them are crooks. And so they will sit there and lie and say they didn't get your notice unless you have some way of proving that they did in a way that they cannot deny. And that's why you use officers of the court as a third-party witness. Is there a price for your freedom that you're not willing to pay? The burden is on the sovereigns to know and understand the law and to assert our sovereignty. All contracts must be entered into knowingly, willingly, and intentionally. They are all a fraud. But the burden is on us to bring up the issue. If somebody is walking down the street and some guy comes walking up to you and says, "You owe me $50, and you give them the $50, then you must owe it. If they come walking down the street and they say, "You owe me $50, and you say, "Well, you know, according to your tax return, I didn't have to pay that because your rule said I didn't have to pay it." Well, you just submitted the contract. So the real issue that you're supposed to bring up is, where's the contract? Did I agree to pay you anything? But if you talk about their statutes and codes, you're admitting the contract. And that's exactly what the IRS does. Quote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it accepts what never was and never will be," unquote. And that's a quote by Thomas Jefferson. We have to stay out of anything that they view to be a contract. Driver's license, social security number, birth certificate, voter's registration are the biggest ones. And we need to start doing things the common law way And that means recording our births and our marriages and our genealogy and things in the family Bible. That's the way it's done. We have to follow my procedures to give the de facto officials notice that defeats their presumptions and force them to honor their oaths. We have to work together with others of a like mind to convene our common law grand juries and our common law trial juries and bring criminals to justice. We have to work together to educate people about what is happening and how to defeat it. Nobody said it would be easy, but it is possible. And what's the alternative? So that's essentially the summary that I go through at the beginning and at the end of my presentation. So I guess we'll get started on citizenship. And I've actually added some material since the last time I did this. So there's going to be new material, but we're not going to get it all through today, I don't think. We'll just cover as much as we can and then cover it next week. Sovereignty exists because of common law. The people in all countries with the common law of England owe their sovereignty to the common law. In Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, all common law countries in the world, the people are the sovereignty. Now, I don't know if you know this, but most countries, like there's a European common law, there's a Russian common law, there's just about every country on the planet has a common law. Because all the countries were occupied by European countries at one point or another, and that's what brings it in. There is an American empire. The Philippines is part of the United States. I've seen court cases that talk about it. China was a part of the United States until they had a communist revolution that went on back in after the Second World War. And if you go into the Title 28 United States Code, you'll find that it talks about a U.S. District Court for the District of China. So China was part of the United States at one time, although I don't believe it is anymore. But Japan is, and every country that was liberated by the United States during the Second World War, and also European countries, there's all common law there, and now most recently there'll be Africa and Afghanistan. Not Africa, Iraq. So common law was brought into England with the Magna Carta. Actually, the Magna Carta just affirms common law. We'll talk about that. And this is taken from Commentaries on the Laws of England by Sir Edward Coke. And it existed prior to the Magna Carta, and it's probably existed from the beginning of time, because common law is essentially the law as found in the Bible. Close. The law of England is divided into three parts: the common law, which is the most general and ancient law of the realm, statutes or acts of parliament, and particular customs. The common law appeareth in the statute of Magna Carta and other ancient statutes, which are, for the most part, are affirmations of the common law, unquote. And that's a quote from Sir Edward Coke, his book, or a series of books. I think it's a series of 4 books, and this one's called The First Part of the Institutes of Laws of England. And Sir Edward Coke lived 1552 to 1634. Now, the interesting thing is that it says, which for the most part are affirmations of the common law. In other words, they're simply affirming something that's already here. That's all they're doing. They're just acknowledging that it exists. An affirmation is something that you just acknowledge that it exists. That's all. The handbook, the Canadian Handbook for Judges, says on page 97, Canada is part of what we call a common law world. And England provided the fountain from which the common law emerged. Thousands of English decisions are now, by adoption, embedded in our jurisprudence, and the decisions of the House of Lords and other English courts will continue, we think, to be cited in our courts and must be given the most careful and respectful consideration as highly persuasive. Unquote. I think that speaks for itself. On page 98 of the Canadian Handbook for Judges, it says, quote, the judgments of Australia and New Zealand courts may also have a highly persuasive effect, and the similarity not just of the legal system, but of the conditions in the United States is such that many American decisions may too have a strong persuasive effect. Unquote. So what we're going to learn about is what is a sovereign, who is a sovereign, where does sovereignty come from, rights and duties of sovereignty, how you can lose sovereignty, and how you can regain your sovereignty. Sovereignty is the right to rule. Sovereign can be a king or a queen. Sovereign can be a group of people. And a sovereign can be a living soul. Quote, sovereignty is the right to govern. A nation or state sovereign is the person or persons in whom that resides, unquote. And that's taken from a U.S. Supreme Court case, Chisholm versus Georgia, found at 2 Dallas, page 440. Quote, for the very idea that one may be compelled to hold his life or the means of living or any material right essential to the enjoyment of life at the mere will of another seems to be intolerable in any free country where freedom prevails as being the essence of slavery itself, unquote. And that's Yickwill versus Hopkins, 118 U.S. Supreme Court, page 356. In a monarchy, the king or queen is sovereign. In a British common law country, the sovereigns are the people. And you have to understand that. But what happens over time, if you're asleep at the wheel, you wind up giving up your sovereignty and you become a subject. And you've probably heard of British subjects. Well, the citizenship that you see these days is equivalent to subjects, and we're going to talk about that. Quote, the words people of the United States and citizens are synonymous terms and mean the same thing. They both describe the political body who, according to our republican institutions, form the sovereignty, and who hold the power and conduct the government through their representatives. They are what we familiarly call the sovereign people, and every citizen of one of this people and a constituent member of the sovereignty, unquote. And that's U.S. Supreme Court case Dred Scott versus Sandra, found at 60 U.S. 393. And that was like about 1857, just before the Civil War, because when the Civil War happened, everything changed. Quote, now this is an Australian court case. Quote, translated into constitutional terms, it denotes that the sovereign power that resides in the people is exercised on their behalf by their representatives, unquote. That's Australian Capital Television versus Commonwealth. That's 66 Australian Reports, page 695. Here's another Australian court case. Quote, the powers of government in this country are derived from the people who are the ultimate sovereign, unquote. That's Ridgway versus the Queen. 69 Australian Reports, page 484. This is a New York court case. Quote, the people are sovereign and not bound by general words and statutes restrictive of prerogative, right, title, or interest unless expressly named. Acts of limitation do not bind the king or the people. The people have been ceded all the rights of the king, the former sovereign. It is a maxim of the common law that when an act is made for the common good and to prevent injury, the king shall be bound, though not named. But when a statute is general and prerogative right would be divested or taken from the king or the people, he shall not be bound, unquote. So we're all kings and queens. And that case is People versus Herkimer, That's 4 colon 345. And that took place in 1825. Quote, at the Revolution, the sovereignty devolved on the people, and they are truly the sovereigns of the country. But they are sovereigns without subjects, and have none to govern but themselves. The citizens of America are equal as fellow citizens and as joint tenants in the sovereignty. Unquote. That is Chisholm versus Georgia, 2 Dallas, page 440. U.S. Supreme Court again, 1795. Quote, people of the state are entitled to all the rights which formerly belonged to the king by his prerogative. Unquote. That's Lansing versus Smith at 4 Wendell 920, 1829, New York. Quote, it will be admitted on all hands that with the exception of the powers granted to the states and the federal government through the Constitution, the people of the several states are unconditionally sovereign within their respective states. Unquote. That's Ohio Life Insurance Company and Telephone Company versus DeBolt, and that's 16 Howard, page 416. That's U.S. Supreme Court. So we're unconditionally sovereign. That's why they have to criminally convert your name. They can never, ever talk to a living soul. They have no authority. They cannot see you. You have to think of it like it's the Matrix. They don't have a shred of authority to talk to a living soul. Quote, governments are but trustees, acting under derived authority, and have no power to delegate what is not delegated to them. But the people, as the original fountain, might take away what they have delegated and entrust to whom they please. The sovereignty in every state resides in the people of the state, and they may alter and change their form of government at their own pleasure. Unquote. That's Luther versus Borden. That's 48 U.S. 1. That's a U.S. Supreme Court case. The only power that the government has is power that we delegate. Quote, a sovereign is exempt from suit not because of any formal conception or obsolete theory, but on a logical and practical ground that there can be no legal right as against the authority that makes the law on which the right depends. Unquote. That's Kawanikoa versus Polyblank. That's 205 U.S. 349, U.S. Supreme Court again, and that's in 1907. And this is affirming the 11th Amendment. In other words, there's nothing, if you think about this, there's nothing the government can do to affect the people. And that's what this court case is saying. They cannot sue the people. They cannot do anything to the people. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unquote. That's taken from the U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776. And that is considered positive law, too, by the way. Now, the pursuit of happiness is making money. You're not happy if you can't eat. And that's exactly what that's talking about. That's your right to get compensation for labor. And the Supreme Court has said that compensation for labor is not taxable. That's why on a tax return, they want to know your occupation. Not many people put down their laborer. They think that they're an engineer or a psychologist, but anything else is taxable. If you're a laborer, that's not a taxable event. Quote, actually this isn't quote. The Magna Carta is called the Great Charter of English Liberty. The Canadian Handbook for Judges cites the Magna Carta on page 77. Now it's quote. Magna Carta says, we will not deny or defer to any man either justice or right, unquote. That's on page 77 of the Canadian Handbook for Judges. So don't let anybody ever tell you that the Magna Carta doesn't apply. It definitely applies. I argue it in America, too. It's a little bit harder because of the fact that there's a Constitution here, but it shows what happened. And the Supreme Court even talks about the Magna Carta. And I've got court cases that talk about it. Quote, the Magna Carta is not a unilateral act emanating solely from the spontaneous will of the king, as the charters of the predecessors of John. Neither is it a treaty, for we cannot say it was concluded between two legitimate and independent sovereignties, nor between two nations, nor is it a law. The barons do not appear in it as subjects, for they are freed from their promise of fidelity, and the king, brought captive, placed before them, submitted to the conditions which the conquerors imposed upon him. Magna Carta is therefore a contract, but resembles a treaty concluded between two nations, in that one of the parties, in the virtue of the law of war, can impose its will upon the other, unquote. And that's Berlin versus Pichet and Attorney General of Canada, and that's referenced habeas corpus, and that's at 4 Dominion Law Reports, page 147. That's a Canadian court case. It's actually a Quebec court case. And what it's saying is they essentially stuck a sword to his throat, and they said, here, King, we want you to sign it. And the contract is that he agreed to sign it, and they agreed not to kill him. The Queen or the President has an oath of office. We, the people, owe no allegiance to the Queen or the President. I tell them that all the time. I send stuff to the Queen. I send stuff to the President. And I tell them I don't owe you any allegiance. You owe me allegiance. Do you know who you are? Think about it. Why do we set up governments in the first place? We set up governments for protection from foreign enemies. We set up governments for protection from each other, so that I don't go and kill somebody, or if I do, there's somebody that's going to hunt me down and bring me to justice. And we set up governments to administer disputes in a fair and impartial manner. If I go and run over somebody's dog so that they have a right to sue me over it, and the court administers it in a fair and impartial manner. The only legitimate function of government is to protect the rights of the people. You think about it, God is the King of Kings. He created we the people. We the people created government. Government created corporations. And so therefore the government and corporations are both subordinate to we the people. And that's what we have to do, is we got to understand the proper order of things. Okay, well, I guess we ought to... Oh, we got 8 minutes, okay. I thought we had 3 minutes. Okay, we'll keep going. So, what every once in a while I hear, especially up in Canada, where the Communist Party, I mean the New Democratic Party, goes and puts out that they want to take God out of the Constitution. Well, first of all, the Queen's oath is to God, and so there's no way that that would ever happen in Canada. But they like, the communists like to put that out there and see what people are thinking. Anyways, bottom line is that our rights come from God, and if our rights come from God, only God can take them away. And that's why the communists want to take God out of the Constitution, Because then the sheeple that are totally clueless will think that the government grants them rights. There are only two major classes of citizenship, and there's state and federal. And you can read a state citizen as the sovereign class, and the federal citizen as a subject. And that's how it works, and that's how people have become subjects in the past, too. And this is as old as time itself. It goes back literally thousands of years, and we'll talk about it. It's in the Bible, even. Quote, there is in our political system a government of each of the several states and the government of the United States. Each is distinct from the other and has citizens of its own, unquote. That's U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. versus Cruikshank, 92 U.S. 542. Quote, one may be a citizen of a state and yet not a citizen of the United States, unquote. That's McDonald versus State. That's Indiana, 90 Indiana Reports, page 320. Quote, there is a clear distinction between national citizenship and state citizenship. That's U.S. Supreme Court, Tushiro versus Jordan, 278 U.S. 123. Quote, instead, this provision protects only those rights peculiar to being a citizen of the federal government. It does not protect those rights which relate to state citizenship. That's Jones versus Timmer. That's 89 Federal Supplements, page 1226, and that's a 1993 court case. Quote, citizenship of the United States does not entitle to citizens to the privileges and immunities of the citizens of a state, since the privileges of one are not the same as the other. That's Tushiro versus Jordan, and that's 255 Pacific Reports, page 545, and that's California Supreme Court. Quote, privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States do not necessarily include all the rights protected by the first 8 amendments to the federal constitutions against the powers of the federal government, unquote. That's Maxwell versus Dow, U.S. Supreme Court. 20 Supreme Court reports, page 448. And essentially what that is saying is that U.S. citizens don't have access to the first 8 amendments to the federal constitution against the powers of the federal government. U.S. citizens don't have any rights that aren't granted by Congress. Quote, the only absolute and unqualified right of a United States citizen is to residence within the territorial boundaries of the United States, unquote. That's U.S. versus Valentine. 288 Federal Supplements, 957. The same thing exists in Canada. And it exists in every other country, too. The charter adopted in 1982 refers to citizens of Canada several times. Well, what's Canada? Canada is a corporation. The courts have told us that laws of Canada are federal laws. Citizens of Canada are federal citizens. And Canadians include state citizens and federal citizens. But they're going to presume that you're a federal citizen and violate your rights until you shift the burden of proof. In the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 3 says every citizen of Canada. Section 6.1 says every citizen of Canada. Section 6.2 says every citizen of Canada. Section 23.1 says citizens of Canada. Section 23.2 says citizens of Canada. Section 23.3 says right of citizens of Canada. Okay, I guess we'll turn it over to Patty because I think we're about out of time.
Okay, thank you, Glenn, for another, although abbreviated, very informative show. And sorry we had some technical issues there and didn't get the full 2 hours. I know there's a lot of people that are very interested in what you have to say. So be sure to tune in next Sunday at 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. for Glenn Winningham and Do You Know Who You Are? And so everybody have a good night. Remember your neighbor, he's not the enemy, he's not a terrorist, he's just your neighbor. Get to know him, get to know your community, make the changes and the solutions that need to be in your area. And with that being said, good night, Glenn, and everyone from TCT Radio. And we'll see you all
Thank you.
on the other side. You're welcome, Glenn.